Welcome, everybody, to the Encounter Faith podcast. My name is Ross, and I am privileged to be able to have these kinds of conversations. And today is a really special one because I get to sit down with Amy Simpson. Amy, thank you for joining us. Thanks for doing this.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. It's a privilege to talk with you and a pleasure.
Now, in context, as you and I are having this conversation, you yesterday were a guest preacher here at Good Shepherd Lutheran Church, but there's a lot more to what you do, why we were able to bring you in for the start of a new series all about mental health, the conversations we're having around it. We're calling it Anatomy of the Soul, which I really liked as far as a series title, just because I feel it feels very vivid and very descriptive to what the kind of conversations we're going to have. But I do think it's helpful for people to understand a little bit about your background. So first and foremost, you are an author. There's a couple different books that people can check out in the show notes wherever you're listening to learn a little bit more about your writings. But you also have a pretty cool job at Tyndale. Can you help people understand the scope of your ministry?
Yeah, actually, I've spent my career pretty much working in and around Christian publishing. But at this point, I work as the publisher for Bibles at Tyndale House Publishers. Which means I get to be in charge of Bible publishing for one of the largest Bible publishers in the world.
And this is like super Christianese and like in the weeds, but there's something amusing to me about publisher of Bibles at Tyndale. Like there's some words in there that are redundant to a certain extent because like Tyndale's the people that publish Bibles. That's what they do.
Yeah. We also publish books.
Yes. Yes. I want to make sure you don't get in trouble at work tomorrow, but it's something. One of the things that I appreciate about it is you yesterday are able to give this message, which again, people can find in the show notes wherever you're listening, that is so deeply rooted in not only the current mental health conversations that we're having, but also the current church conversations we're having, the ways that the church gets this right, the way that the church gets this wrong. And too often around the conversation about mental health, the church gets it wrong and gets it very wrong. One of the things that stood out to me about your message yesterday was it helps kind of level set some common misconceptions and particularly the role of the church. And we're going to talk about this towards the end, what the church can do. But I want to start with how we got here. It feels like a pretty common understanding that the church isn't very good at this, that the church isn't very good at having these conversations. This was a conversation that was a big part of your personal story and part of what brought you to where you are today. But I'm curious, just as a subject matter expert, how do you feel like we arrived at this moment where conversations around mental health and conversations around the church feel so separate?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually, because if you look at history, the history of the church and the history of treatment for mental illness and mental health care, for most of history, they were actually closely intertwined.
Sure.
Most of the work that's been done in this area has been done by people of faith. Most of the world, it's been actually Christians who've kind of pioneered mental health care at all, So, Christians, I think a lot of people know, and many probably don't, started the first hospitals, just
right
in general. That's true for mental health hospitals as well. And back in the in the early church, the idea that we would care for, even specifically care for and lovingly provide for people who are affected by medical problems at all, let alone mental health problems, was a totally foreign idea. It was pretty much a new concept that was pioneered by Christians. And then going forward through history, more and more Christians were really the only people who were offering this kind of care for people. There were communities set up specifically to monasteries and stuff specifically to receive and care for people with mental health disorders. Now, they would have characterized them probably a little differently than we talk about them today. And yet, specifically caring for and seeing the need to take care of. Then throughout history, that continued as they set up hospitals and, even like asylums and stuff. For the most part, compassionate care was pioneered by Christians. And there are multiple points in history where there's been like some reform around that's done. And that's pretty much always been done initiated by Christians. In the 20th century, in the mid 20th century or early to mid, the system had gotten once again really bad, really kind of brutal.
The like social safety net, the social
Yeah.
system. Yeah,
Yeah. And there was kind of a need for reform. So in during World War II, there were many people who were part of like Anabaptist traditions and pacifist traditions who did not want to who serve, who if like basically serve on the front lines and actually
right.
engage in warfare. And so if they were drafted, they were allowed to serve elsewhere. And many of them were assigned to work in these asylums and hospitals. And so when they saw the
That's so
conditions
interesting.
there, yeah, when they saw the conditions there and realized, wow, these we're treating these people very poorly, they initiated a lot of reform in those institutions. So that's just one example, like one of the more recent examples of how Christians have kind of continually come alongside and not only pioneered, but then driven reform in the mental health care system. Now, all of that began to shift really in the 20th century, like early 20th century, around this is a bit of an oversimplification, but basically around Freud. Okay.
Okay.
Because when psychology became a thing, it was very secular. And psychology was basically rooted in like kind of an anti-religion mindset.
Sure.
So basically psychology, like religion and faith were kind of considered to be disorders in themselves, signs of disorder. So because of that, which I'll like fully acknowledge that's not a great point of view, and not compatible with Christian faith, but I would say that there was a strong reaction then within the church against psychology and against like anything that was kind of informed by that point of view. So we had mutual distrust and reactivity happening. So I think we still are dealing with the fallout of that, even though the interesting thing is nowadays, most mental health providers, even if they are not people of faith, they will acknowledge the importance of faith or faith practices or spirituality of some kind, at least kind of a bare bones kind of spiritual, the aspect of spirituality.
Yeah, you may not agree with the theology in print, but the idea being that most mental health professionals, the mental health professionals in my life certainly, really appreciated and understood the benefit of my faith on a clinical level.
Exactly. And if you look at the research that's been done out there, it's pretty much, it's hard to argue that's, I mean, I don't know if anybody would really argue that there's value in that. So by and large, the field of psychology and mental health professionals, even if they're not people of faith at all, they will acknowledge that there's value there. They have respect and room for, faith or even at least religious activity. And so that's really changed, but I think there's still a lot of kind of suspicion within the church. And let's acknowledge some of the suspicion is mutual too. I don't mean to say that, all of everyone involved in psychology is super, into the church or something. But I think there's a lot of suspicion on the side of believers who are like, that's that's bad, or they're going to lead people away, or it's other. So it's not specifically Christian, or it's not, so they're suspicious of it. I think, so it's interesting that we find ourselves here because it's actually not where we've been through most of history.
I love, sorry,
no, I was just going to say, I think we've suffered on both sides for it, that.
It feels that way because I love the fact that you walk people through that, because one, I think most people who listen to this podcast on a regular basis are just as much of nerdy dorks as I am. So like there is part of that where I'm like, I know that's just genuinely an interesting thing about our society. But two, I think it speaks to this macro problem that most people who are listening have seen play out in the context of wherever their local church is. You actually talked about this in your message, where you talked about how the need for a better understanding starts with the fact that for most churches, most Christ followers, this is not a conversation we're engaging in. And you described it as it's full of well-intended and quote, good people who let
Mm-hmm.
fear prevent them from the ministry or the good of any particular family.
Right.
And what I so appreciate about that idea of like well-intended and good people is because it speaks to this tension that I think people feel in the broadest sense of any sort of conversation around mental health, which is, I don't know what to do. I
Mm-hmm.
want to help. I'm a good person, but I'm not qualified enough, or I don't know enough, or this person is too far outside of my context. I don't know what to do. Can you speak to the advantage of a bunch of people who not knowing what to do, just leaning in and doing something has over a bunch of people not knowing what to do and leaning away? Like, what difference does it make for the folks when they lean in?
Yeah, and actually, I love that you use that language because that's language that I use a lot to describe what people do and what people experience is the leaning, like moving toward versus moving away.
Sure.
Um, and you think about like a lot of forms of crisis and illness and difficulty in people's lives, and people tend to lean in, right? They tend to move towards. So, for example, if I'm diagnosed with cancer, and I've got somebody's going to set up a Caring Bridge site for me probably that day. Somebody's got a GoFundMe page for me probably that day.
Mm-hmm.
People are probably tripping over themselves to bring food to my family. And I've got people asking questions, and ready to listen to me. They might do that poorly. So I'm not saying that everybody knows how to do all of that really well, but
100%. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's exactly, I love the fact that you said that, because we put this extra pressure on ourselves when conversation around mental health that we're supposed to be experts in it. And that doesn't happen in any other area of our life.
that's right. I am not surrounded by people who are experts in oncology. Like nobody around me knows how to cure cancer, and I don't have
Right.
cancer as far as I know, but
Right.
I'm just using that as an example. Yeah, I don't know how to cure cancer, and I don't know anybody who really does, although I have met a few who might know how to help treat it. But yet that doesn't stop people from expressing concern, from seeing immediately there are needs that I can help meet here.
Yeah.
Whether it's funding or it's food or whatever it is, or just friendship, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the interesting thing is we know how to do that with other forms of crisis, and it involves a movement toward. Let me move toward this moment. And when there's a mental health crisis or problem involved, what people tend to experience instead is people moving away from them. And for most people, this is the most painful thing in their lives, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
This is the most vulnerable moment for them. And this is the moment at which they find people distancing themselves, whether they mean to or not. It's
Mm-hmm.
that it may be just that like sense of I don't know. There may be other motivations there too, but sometimes it's as simple as like I really care and I don't know what to do. And
Mm-hmm.
the effect of that, like people moving away from you at your most vulnerable, it's really devastating for people, and it speaks volumes. Unfortunately, it says a lot about, it can say a lot about God to people when
Yeah.
we're talking about within the context of the church, or within the
Mm-hmm.
context of faith. Unfortunately, because we sort of represent Christ to each other, not sort of, we do.
Yeah.
um,
Biblically. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, then that we can help reinforce for each other the idea that is easy to creep into our minds in a moment like that I'm abandoned, I'm alone, this means
Mm-hmm.
God doesn't love me, Christ is not with me. We can reinforce those messages for each other by our movement away from each other.
What I hope people hear from that too is, yes, we have a tremendous responsibility as Christ followers. We have a tremendous responsibility as people of the church. To put it in my world in terms of communications, we also have a tremendous PR problem in this specific issue. And part of the reason why that exists is not just because of sort of more salacious examples or newsworthy examples of churches getting this dramatically wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, part of the reason why this PR problem exists is the day in and day out moments of folks leaning out instead of leaning in. I talk about this in a couple different contexts of even just sort of general church baggage. If you were able to have all of the church baggage that is rooted in someone giving an answer they weren't quite sure of because they felt like they were supposed to have an answer, rather than saying, I don't know, let's go find that out together, to a tough question, a lot more people would be in our churches.
That's true.
And I feel like part of this is also fueled by the fact that so many people, the majority of people who go to church, have always been in the church. Depending on whatever study, it's between 60 to some studies say as high as 70% of folks who make up your adult population have been in the context of the church for their entire lives. That's why child discipleship folks talk about that sort of 4 to 14 window.
Right.
What I'm curious about is the ways in which you talked about it in your message, talking about how loving is our mission. The ways that when we do this friendship thing right, when we do this community thing right, when we do this loving people right, it's actually a tool of evangelism that many of the folks who aren't good at this would also love to appreciate. Can you speak to when the church gets this right because of this public perception, it actually has greater impact than some other institutions?
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, I mean, part of that is the idea that, just even spiritually speaking, we do represent Christ, right? And so when we are loving toward people, when we represent his compassion and his affection and grace for people, we are great ambassadors, right, of Christ himself. And that's powerful. And the Holy Spirit works through those encounters, So even so spiritually speaking, there's a lot of power in our response to other people and a lot of responsibility that goes with that. But even practically speaking, when you think about the vulnerability again of people in this position, and the fact that I mentioned this yesterday, the mental, and I could talk a long time about this, but the mental health care system is really difficult to navigate.
Yeah.
It's actually badly broken. It's really messed up in several ways. And one of the problems is that we have a severe shortage of mental health care workers, and it's just gotten worse since the pandemic. So for example, in 1950, we had, I'm not going to remember the statistics right, so I probably shouldn't give them, but we have about 10 times fewer psychiatric beds available per the population than we did in 1950. So
Yikes.
I shouldn't quote statistics that I can't remember perfectly off the top of my head, but basically there's just a lot less available. So there's a lot less available, and it's hard to access. So that's part of the reason that people go to the church as their first stop, because you can find one on the corner, right? And it's open probably during the week, and you can walk in. Nobody's going to stop you, and you have to pay to get in, and you don't have to involve your insurance company. And that's part of the reason people go to the church. So when we make ourselves, when we recognize that we're playing that role and we respond well to that, practically speaking, even if it's just a matter of being a bridge for someone to another resource, that is, that's a great way to respond to that responsibility. But the way we do that, the compassion that we show, the kindness, the care, the recognition that this is a suffering human being and someone whom the Lord loves tenderly, it speaks volumes. Even if it doesn't seem to make a difference to someone, because all it does is meet their expectations.
Yeah. That's good.
we avoid hurting them or not meeting their expectations, because people are coming. So they're coming not only because, of access, right? They're also coming because whether or not people engage with a church when they're doing well, they do expect that when they're not, we're going to be there. And they do expect that we're going to live up to what we say we'll do, what we say we value, which is grace and kindness and love and care. And, yes, truth, and all of those things. Like, that's part of the promise of the church, and we actually claim to believe in those things. So people actually believe us, and they come to us expecting those things. When we don't live up to those things, that has a huge negative impact on how people see the church.
Oh man, you and I could talk about this for like 6 hours. Okay, so for purposes of just kind of confining some of this conversation, and again, this is why I tell people like why show notes in the podcast exist, because there's so much more that Amy and I could talk to or speak about. Excuse me. Amy's written books about this that are in the show notes to help kind of contextualize some of what's being described. You also have a new book coming out. Can you let people know a little bit what they can expect come April, whenever they're listening to this?
Yeah, I think this will be a nice kind of follow-up title to Troubled Minds, which is the one that really kind of issues a call to the church to fulfill our mission in response to people with mental illness and their loved ones. This one is simply called Mental Illness: What to Know and How to Help. And this one is
great.
This one is really aimed at like family members and loved ones, maybe friends, who know somebody who's got this struggle and who are coming alongside them. It's a short book. It's super like straightforward and practical, and just kind of aimed at like, okay, what can I do? So I think could be helpful to a lot of people to be aware of that resource coming as well.
You talked about two different kind of metrics for this, one of which being how many folks seek out the church first when they're going through a period of crisis, and the other being about just how widespread this conversation should be relative to the population. So to contextualize this for the conversation, when people are starting to go through that series of crises, how many of them are going to the church? Because I would imagine a lot of people listening are unaware of the role we're playing in the life of the community.
Yeah. So I'll back up one step from there and just make another point to help set this in context. And that is, you mentioned the 20% of the population, which I mentioned yesterday and is a true statistic, but I should expand on that, because actually the 20% is, in any given year, that is the percentage of the adult population in the US who's dealing with a mental health problem in that year.
So just to pause for a second, dear listener, right? So we're talking about 1/5 of the adult population is walking through some level of mental health challenge. I'm trying to put as broad a language to this as possible every single year. Yep. And why I love a stat like that is because there is no church in America there's no church in the world that is addressing that level, that conversation to that scope. And I say that not in a judgmental tone, church. I say that in the tone of every single one of us has a role to do to make this better for those who are coming into our community.
That's right.
Please continue. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'll build on that too and say, because that's in any given year, that does not represent the lifetime prevalence of mental illness, because for many people, they experience something this year that they're not experiencing next year or the year after that. So it's actually closer to 50% of the population that at one point in their lives will experience some kind of diagnosable mental health disorder.
Oh, so, gracious. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the statistics are just enormous. The percentage of people who, and the number of people who are affected by mental health problems is greater than heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and HIV and AIDS combined in the US. And yet, when you look at the attention and the funding and everything that goes toward those diseases, compared to what we put behind mental health problems, it's not even close. So anyway, this is not what you asked about, but I just wanted to frame.
No, I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did.
The issue that we're talking about a huge percentage of the population. The global burden of disease, the World Health Organization has defined mental illness as the #1 contributor to global burden of disease around the world. And specifically major depression is the most significant, but
sure.
Yeah, so it's a huge issue. And then the statistic that you were asking about was that when people reach out for help, they look for some kind of help or treatment related to mental illness. 25% of them will go to a member of the clergy as their first stop. About 16% will go to a psychiatrist, about 16% or psychologist. About 16% will go to a general medical doctor, who also are very much frontline mental health workers, because of that access again. And then the numbers go down from there. The percentages go down from there. So 25% are first going to a member of the clergy, which in the US means for almost everyone a church, right?
Right.
And it's a huge statistic and eclipses all the other options for people. So churches basically are the number one frontline mental health care resource in this country. And most churches have no idea that that's true.
Yeah. And part of, I want to kind of contextualize this as we begin to land the plane here, because part of where I feel like there are such easy steps for folks to take. And again, in the context of your message, you walk through, I think 9 different steps that a church can take. But for the purposes of this conversation, you talk about how, you mentioned this earlier, how treatment for going through any sort of mental health challenge can be pretty grueling. Mm-hmm. There's underfunding, there's not enough resources. And also just from any sort of mental health treatment, there's also a level of, it's not actually as easy. Mm-hmm. You can't treat it like a broken bone because you actually have to spend some time, at least in my experience, it was a lot of what felt like trial and error to find the thing that worked for me.
Yeah, exactly.
So treatments, you said this yesterday, treatments don't equal cures. Mm-hmm. But what the church should be best at is walking with people through those kinds of trials. Mm-hmm. We should be best at being able to be patient with people. We should be best at being able to sort of embrace people no matter where they're at, the ups, the downs, everywhere in between. We should be best at being able to connect people and resource people accordingly because we're well versed in this conversation. Mm-hmm. And when I think about an opportunity to really bring it home to folks at Good Shepherd, a church like ours that is as big as we are and is as well resourced as we are, has a particular responsibility to help change this conversation.
Yeah.
So we're not going to go through all 9, but one of the things that I'm curious about is the folks who are still listening to this podcast, they are looking for that tangible thing. Mm-hmm. They're looking for that next step. They're looking for that thing to do. And what I would tell them is go read one of Amy's books. If for our context, go talk to Pastor Pamela, who oversees the care ministry. But when you talk about being a friend, because that's something that we know how to do. Mm-hmm. If I'm interacting with someone in my life that I go like, I think you might be dealing with some mental health challenge, what is the first thing that I should be doing?
Yeah. So I'll back up from there actually. And that is your theology, which I also mentioned yesterday, that the ways we interact with people and the steps we take are always informed by what we believe. What we do flows from what we believe. So I think I'll just encourage everybody to do the work, also to kind of visit your theology of suffering and of human brokenness, and because when we dive into those things and really check, like, do I have an orthodox Christian view of these topics? Yeah. We realize they drive humility and they drive, just like a right orientation toward, mm-hmm. Toward one another and toward our expectations of life, so that we're not walking around thinking, oh, they have problems and I don't, right? Or they have serious problems and I don't, or they need to be fixed and I don't. And we're also not walking around going, man, life should be easy and fun. And so the fact that person's life is not easy and fun means something is wrong and we need to figure out who to blame. Yeah. So so I just encourage, like, really, and I know not everybody will do a deep dive study on this, but read an article or something, about like what we should expect of one another and of life, and of ourselves. So, but then also, just starting the practical starting point. I always encourage people to start with that idea that you can be a friend to anybody. And I know that can be a big commitment from somebody who is really in need. Mm-hmm. And so I encourage people to pray, like, what is my proximity to this person? What's my responsibility? What am I called to do? Nobody is called to be the complete solution to anybody else's problems. So it is important to draw boundaries and to recognize, there are other resources available to this person. Let me help them. Maybe part of the role you play is to help them see more broadly the resources that are available, so that they're not, you're not becoming sort of codependent with someone. But mm-hmm. But it's really about taking a relational approach so that I'm not like, let me throw this solution at you and then pull back, but let me walk with you. And again, not try to fix you or solve your problems. I don't need to feel a responsibility for that. I'm not qualified for that, but I can be with you. I can walk with you. I can be a friend to you. And literally everyone knows how to do that. Whether we do it always really well or not, that's part of the human experience. But moving toward people and being friends with them and being relational in our approach is a great place to start. And then the other, I think, great place to start that's pretty accessible to people is to engage in those practical helps that we already know how to offer to people in crisis. And churches tend to be really good at this. Like I mentioned earlier, the providing meals, and even if it's as simple as, let me ask you how you're doing. Because again, when there's a mental health problem involved, often like we think that we shouldn't ask about it, or we don't really want to talk about it, or we don't know how to talk about it. Now, there are very bad ways to bring it up or to talk about it, but there are also good ways to do that, particularly if you're covering that base of being relational and being a friend. And if I'm a friend to you, and the hardest thing in your life is around your emotional or life, or the way you're mentally processing your life, that's taken up a lot of space for you. And boy, if you really believe that I care about that and I want to know how you're doing, it's going to probably be a huge relief for you to have that conversation with somebody, and you have the choice how much you want to share or not. But if I show an interest in that and I'm willing to listen and to still move toward you after you tell me what you're struggling with, man, that's 90% of what people need from us, honestly.
Thank you for listening to the Encounter Faith podcast. This podcast is a service of G. Shep Productions from Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Naperville, Illinois. All rights reserved. If you're in the area, we'd love to meet you on a Sunday morning at our 9 a.m. or 10:45 services. At Good Shepherd, we are inviting everyone to walk together in the calling of Christ for a life of eternal impact. This podcast is produced and hosted by me, Ross Cochran, and our theme song is Wake the Earth by 1111 Worship. Thank you for listening. We'll talk again soon.